Hey guys, what's up? Like in many fields of science and history, linguists love to argue, and since I'm now in my last semester of college, I figured what better way to celebrate on YouTube than explain some of the most contentious conflicts in the fields that I've learned about. The off-YouTube celebrations will be a bit different. So basically, I'm just going to describe the arguments, present both sides, and then on some of them I may tell you which side to support, but I won't take a side on all of them, so be ready for that. I will not, however, be covering fringe hypotheses. They are not important. I'm sure this will be the most civil comment section I've ever seen. Without any more waiting, let's go! First up, you could start a fight between linguists by saying one word, which is Altaic. I'm talking about the Altaic language family, which may or may not exist, something historical linguists can't quite agree on. The family was first proposed at an unclear time in the 16, 17, or 1800s, potentially by a few people simultaneously. If true, then the Altaic language family would spread right through the middle of Asia and would include the Turkic, Mongolic, Tungusic, and Japonic languages, as well as Korean. The name comes from the Altai Mountains, which are in northern Asia, split between the China-Mongolia border and the Russia-Kazakhstan border, which some consider the Ojaimat. This lineup varies somewhat depending on the scholar. For example, the Uralic languages were briefly included in the family in the 1800s, but this is now rarely believed. There's also some doubt about Korean and Japanese's inclusion in the macro family, but nonetheless, all of that is irrelevant to the people who don't think the family even exists. So what are some of the arguments linguists put forward over this? Well, the supporters of the Altaic hypothesis, known as Altaicists, say that there's enough evidence among the grammar and vocabulary to prove that the languages in question have a common ancestor. The Altaicists have, in fact, reconstructed what they believe to be Proto-Altaic. Some of the features of Proto-Altaic are a three-way phonation distinction on plosives and affricates of voiced, voiceless, and aspirated, 8 phonemic vowels, possibly vowel length distinction, and pitch accent. As well, the reconstructed vocabulary in Proto-Altaic includes the three main categories you'd expect to find in a proto-language: pronouns, numerals, and body parts. On the other hand, people who oppose the Altaic hypothesis, known as anti-Altaicists, say that many of the grammatical correspondences among the languages, as well as some of the vocabulary, are evidence of a prehistoric North Asian Sprachbund rather than a common origin. In other words, the smaller proto-languages were geographically near each other before they spread into their current positions, and while they were there, they formed a Sprachbund with effects that can still be felt today, but that doesn't mean they all descend from the same language. For one example of this, one of the main things that the potentially Altaic languages all have in common is an SOV sentence structure. Altaicists may say this points to a common origin, but anti-Altaicists will argue that aside from the fact that SOV is the most common word order in the world, sentence structure tends to be very highly influenced by Sprachbunds. When a language enters a new Sprachbund, its sentence structure is often one of the first things to go in some way. Therefore, sharing the world's most common word order doesn't exactly convince many people that there's a common origin. Outside of that, anti-Altaicists also say that the Altaicists' reconstructed vocabulary is insufficient to rule out coincidences and that the proposed sound changes are inconsistently followed in the vocabulary. So there's your two sides summarized. What do I think? Well, sorry to disappoint, but I don't have a side in this one. I've personally decided that I'm not going to take a stance on the existence of the Altaic language family until I've learned languages from at least 2 of the potentially Altaic subfamilies. And the number of potentially Altaic languages I've learned to this point is 0. So I'll just let the Altaicists and anti-Altaicists fight it out below. Next up, we have an issue in morphology, that being, where do we draw the line on what a case is? My term paper in morphology was about this exact subject, so I've already done my fair share of research on it, and realistically, this may warrant a video of its own. But in order to not end up regurgitating my whole 14-page paper from 2 years ago to y'all, I'll just give a basic summary of the points. Basically, what it all boils down to is that our idea of what a case is based mostly on Indo-European languages, and when other languages have to be analyzed, it can be unclear if that language has cases as we see them. To be specific, the case systems of Indo-European languages tend to involve inflections on modifiers, different fusional variations of the cases for gender and number, the individual cases having multiple jobs, and the real kicker, they tend to be suffixes. These parameters can apply to several Indo-European languages like German, Polish, Russian, or Latin. But we don't even need to leave Europe to run into a problem with them. One of the languages often brought up in this battle is Hungarian, which, according to conventional linguistics, has 18 cases. The problem is that Hungarian has postpositions instead of prepositions, meaning they go after the noun. The vast majority of the Hungarian cases do, in fact, have the role of adpositions. They're used for one specific purpose. This is unlike in Russian, for example, where it has prepositions which govern case inflections. The Hungarian postpositions do all the work themselves. Now, not all the postpositions are cases in Hungarian. There are a few factors that differentiate the postpositions from the cases, the main one being that the postpositions aren't subject to the Hungarian vowel harmony system. Speaking of vowel harmony, that's the only thing the case suffixes change for, and it's not a grammatical inflection, it's a form of allomorphy. All in all, this means that of the 4 traits generally found in Indo-European cases, only 1 is found in the Hungarian system, the fact that they're suffixes. If Hungarian hypothetically did its cases with prefixes instead, would we ever be calling them cases? To give the example I did in this term paper, as mentioned before, the Hungarian cases cases map exactly onto these English prepositions, so hypothetically I could say that English has upwards of 30 cases being these. Of course not, it's just these prepositions. We never talk about the circumessive case in English, it's just the preposition around. Outside of the bias toward calling suffixes cases, there are a couple other things that can happen that can confuse morphologists as to whether or not they're cases. For one, the construct state that exists in some of the Semitic languages tends to be called just that, the construct state, not the construct case, even though it's an inflection made on a noun based on its role in the sentence. You know, like a case. If we look at the 4 parameters found in Indo-European cases mentioned earlier, the construct state fits 3 of them. It debatably extends to the article by blocking it. It does take different forms for different genders and numbers, and it's suffixed on. The only parameter it doesn't fit is the multiple jobs thing, unless you want to say that the Arabic possessive is a separate role from supplemental nouns. So why is this such a hot debate if it's a case? Well, you know how I described it in the Hebrew and Arabic language overviews as an inverse genitive? Yeah, so apparently the fact that the construct doesn't indicate the role of the noun, just the presence of another noun, makes some linguists not think of it as a legitimate case. But I would argue that that detail doesn't matter. I'd say its role as main noun being modified by a supplemental noun is perfectly adequate to call it a case. Finally, you know the possessive s suffix found in the Germanic languages that have, for the most part, lost their case inflections? There's a bit of debate about whether that can still be called a genitive case as well, and it's treated a bit differently across the Germanic languages in question. In the relevant North Germanic languages, it's literally included on case charts, while in English it's generally not, and this exact debate I'm summarizing now is alive and well. The main issue here is that the s possessive, wherever it's found in the deflected Germanic languages, is acclitic. Basically, acclitic is like an affix, but it's very regular and attaches to whole phrases instead of specific words. Especially in situations where the noun isn't the last word of the phrase, like the guy who went downtown's car, this makes it difficult to call it a legit genitive case because the s is on the word downtown even though it's modifying guy. But to the other point, it is descended from one of the real genitive suffixes that still exists in the Germanic languages that have cases, the most common one in fact. In addition, it's still used in some places in English, like a friend of my mom's, where it's redundant, adding legitimacy to its possible status as a case. By the way, according to my own grammaticality judgment, this can only be done to humans. So to close out this section, of course, what's my opinion on all this? It's a case-by-case basis, pun intended, but I feel like the construct is undeniably a case, the Germanic s possessive is probably a case, and the Hungarian bound postpositions are probably not cases, even though I'll probably treat them like they are in the eventual Hungarian language overview. Really though, my main opinion is that we need a more solid and less Eurocentric definition of case. Alright, now we're going to talk a little about a debate that's less academic and more just among everyone. In the quest for an easier way to communicate across borders, people from time to time have suggested that instead of elevating some natural languages to international status, artificial languages might do the job better. The most famous example of a language made for this purpose is, of course, Esperanto, which was created in 1887 by L.L. Zamenhof for the explicit purpose of fostering world peace. A noble concept, especially in that time given what would end up happening in the following century. To be clear, it wasn't the first interlang, but it was the first well-known one. However, there were some problems with it based on Zamenhof's personal biases. For one, I can say it's a fairly easy language. If your native language is European, that's where all the parameters, especially the vocab, come from. If your native language isn't European, I'd imagine Esperanto would seem a lot like your typical Romance language. In addition, it has 22 phonemic consonants, which is a large number for an interlang, and it has case declensions. Yeah. All this makes more sense when you consider that Zamenhof was natively bilingual in Yiddish and Russian, but often spoke Polish too, all of which are case languages. Yiddish has 3, Russian has 6, and Polish has 7. So I feel like Zamenhof must have thought the 2 cases was super easy. On the other hand, Esperanto is actually a native language of about 1,000 people and it has very predictable grammar without exceptions, which is massive. And I feel like because it's not as simple as a lot of people think it should be, this counterintuitively makes it a better interlang since it doesn't feel completely artificial. That being said, due to all the flaws in Esperanto, there have been many attempts to either make it better or make a completely different interlang with the same goal, but none of them have reached anywhere close to the popularity of Esperanto. However, this may be changing as of late with Tokipona, a conlang created in 2001 by Canadian linguist and interpreter Sonia Lang. Tokipona has a very small sound inventory of just 14 phonemes, and there are only 120 to 137 words in the whole language, depending on the source and criteria, making it very easy to learn and therefore, hypothetically, a good interlang. But the thing is, it was never designed for that purpose. Tokipona is what we call an engineered language, meaning it was made for a specific purpose other than being used internationally. In this case, to make as simple a language as possible. On the other hand, that simplicity also takes away from its potential as an interlang because with so few words, simple concepts, like names of food items and such, can become very long and potentially ambiguous strings of words, which makes real-life communication a bit challenging. But that's no problem if you're using Tokipona as it was intended, to simplify your thoughts. Basically on this whole issue, I strongly support only using natural languages as lingua francas. Along with everything mentioned above, conlangs can never have the sheer amount of vocabulary that makes natural languages operational, so to talk to people on a day-to-day basis, nature wins every time. Alright, so now I'm gonna finish the video with a bang. Potentially the most heated debates in linguistics revolve around just two words: universal grammar. This is another topic I've had to write a term paper on, and in this case it was for syntactic theory. Some of y'all may remember back in the Swedish language overview that when I was explaining constituents, I prefaced it with, for those of y'all who haven't taken syntactic theory in college, and I'm a little worried that it came off as pretentious. I didn't mean it like that. I actually meant it in a sense of, y'all are lucky to have not suffered through that. Syntactic theory was difficult, and everything I'm about to say will explain why. So back to universal grammar. Basically, this is the idea that humans are born with certain innate limitations on sentence structure, which are universal throughout the species and critical to our ability to use language at all. What we now think of as universal grammar, or UG, was first thought up in the 1960s by a guy you've probably at least somewhat heard of, even if you're not into linguistics. Noam Chomsky. His specific brand of UG, which is what we were all taught to use in syntactic theory, is called generative grammar, which involves a bunch of tree diagrams that I really don't want to explain because I forced them out of my head since taking the class. The trees we ended up using were from the X-bar hypothesis, which is also a Chomskyan creation. To put it as simply as possible, after noticing that the simpler trees didn't account for a lot of stuff that happens in real life, instead of, discarding the theory like a responsible scientist would do, Chomsky added sublayers between the layers called bar layers and marked with an apostrophe in order to create a system that still had problems everywhere. To start, generative grammar is not only Eurocentric but Anglocentric as well. And it doesn't even always work in English. For one, it makes a broad assumption that verbs are bound to their direct objects, which falls apart when you realize that English itself has a double object construction. This model also fails to account for any word order with the subject in the middle, like Irish being VSO. Generative grammar accounts for this by saying that the verb is taking the spot of an auxiliary, but this only works in VSO languages like Irish that have auxiliaries in the first place, and there are VSO languages that don't have auxiliaries like Biblical Hebrew. Generative grammar also puts a very large amount of importance on articles, despite the fact that articles only exist in a minority of languages throughout the world. And sometimes when they do, they can occur on either side of the word, like in most North Germanic languages, which isn't accounted for by the trees. The real kicker is that toward the end of the semester, my syntax professor told us that she herself doesn't even believe in generative grammar, is more of a lexical functional type person, which is one of the many alternative hypotheses to how UG works. To be clear, she was a great professor and I got a 97 on my term paper, so clearly she was just trapped by the curriculum. All this compensation in the tree diagrams kinda reminds me of Ptolemaic geocentrism with the epicycles. Both ideas happened because the scholars involved kept finding errors in their models, but kept updating them to make them more complicated instead of realizing they had fundamental problems. But aside from the debate about how UG works, there's also a debate about whether it exists. Enter Daniel Everett, an American linguist who studies the Pirahan language of northwestern Brazil. In 2005, he published an article claiming that Pirahan violates UG by not having recursion, among other things. Chomsky was not thrilled, to say the least. He used at least two fallacies in his response. Thing is, since Everett is close to the only person who can speak Pirahan and another language, it's difficult for other linguists to judge his claims. Nonetheless, there was an analysis done of the Pirahan corpus in 2012 by several linguists, Everett being one of them, which couldn't conclusively prove that Pirahan had recursion, but also stated that Pirahan may have sentences with recursive structures. Outside of Pirahan, there are other rebuttals to UG, such as it possibly being unfalsifiable, especially if you look at Chomsky's rebuttal to Everett, the language acquisition device possibly being tautological, and some others that I'll put on the screen. These arguments, the main theme of which is that UG is unscientific, do reflect how I feel about this whole mess. Pardon the slur I'm about to use, but I see syntactic theory as purely philosophy. To finish my term paper, I invented my own model to explain UG, which looks like this. I called it box and string theory. I wanted string theory, but it was taken for some reason. Although to sound more legit in my paper, I called it constituent-dominated grammar. What does that mean? I don't know, but I can't understand any of the other names in this field either. I'm not even sure if I believe in box and string theory. I just use it to demonstrate that I feel like instead of making the trees more complicated to solve errors, the academics should have made them simpler. Box and string theory has little to no constraints on grammar, just some building blocks that kids' brains could use to build their grammar. That being said, if you want to say that box and string theory is too simple to even count within UG and therefore I'm just flat out denying it, I won't argue with you. I feel that way too. If universal grammar is God, I'm agnostic. To close out the video, I'll just recap all the arguments I talked about. First, historical linguists can't agree on whether the Altaic language family exists or not. Then, morphologists have a lot of trouble coming to a consensus about what exactly a case is. After that, language enthusiasts in general disagree on whether natural languages or artificial languages would be better for global communication. And finally, arguably the most heated fight in all of linguistics, syntacticians hurl a lot of names at each other over whether kids are born with a set of built-in grammatical constraints and what the system looks like, or whether that concept is completely fake. You got any strong opinions about one of these? Is there another linguistic fight you're mad at me for not mentioning? Comment below, hopefully in a somewhat civil manner. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.